I think most people involved in security get attracted to it because there's a bit of them that likes breaking things. And I think this is even the same with developers. Like developers probably as children pulled their toys apart to see how they worked. My name is Troy Hunt. I develop security software and I built a little website called Have I Been Pwned. I launched Have I Been Pwned in December 2013. Within weeks, it just took on a life of its own. One of the things I did very early on is just optimize as far as I possibly could. So everything from caching as much content as I possibly could through to obviously reducing the overhead on all the requests. So I had things like auto-scale configured on the app servers. If my CPU goes beyond a certain amount for a certain amount of time, then I'd get another instance. And I'd keep sort of adding these logical units of server so it would scale, which is great. And then I had cases like there was a TV show in the UK, ran at prime time, Have I Been Pwned on it? And my traffic just increased hundreds and hundreds of times over in the space of seconds. And I got smashed and I lost requests. I just couldn't deal with it. The thing I couldn't escape is that whilst I was constrained by autoscale on an app service, and whilst I needed to see resources utilized to a certain amount before I added on more resources, I was always going to have this problem. So ultimately the solution came via functions. So I've been moving a huge amount of stuff from APIs running the app service through into functions. And by running serverless, suddenly you have a scale which is not bound by any sort of logical infrastructure over the top of it. And here's sort of the secret behind Have I Been Pwned. The objective wasn't just to build a data breach notification service, the objective was to build a data breach notification service and to play with Azure. There's a few key things that I look for on the dashboard. So I want to see things like, how is my infrastructure performing? A lot less important on functions because they just scale and perform beautifully regardless. But particularly on like my app service, how much of my CPU am I using? Am I going to need to scale into a new instance? On my SQL Azure database, I want to know how many DTUs I'm using, because if I start maxing out those DTUs, I might need to go in and scale it up myself. And even for things like functions, which scale almost endlessly, I still want to see traffic. So I want to see at a glance, is there something going on with Have I Been Pwned that's just driven a massive amount of traffic to the site? And I can see that immediately on the graph. The single best decision I made in terms of the services to use at the beginning of Have I Been Pwned was to use table storage. This is where the bulk of the guts of the data is. So there's 5.5 billion records sitting here in table storage. It's not the only storage construct I use. I use SQL Azure as well. And in SQL Azure, what I've got is things like data loads and notification users. The app service is the website, and then increasingly what I'm doing is I'm shifting stuff down into functions. And then when these functions are executed, functions are talking to a combination of SQL Azure, plus of course when you actually search for someone, that needs to go to table storage. And then the Redis cache is storing a bunch of things like a list of the breaches. One of the things I'm trying to do about optimizing Azure for just massive amounts of API consumption is move as much traffic as I can from the origin site in Azure and push it back towards the customer. Because that keeps a lot of traffic off my origin, lets me scale more. It also means people get requests returned in a super fast way. So Cloudflare sits in front of all my Azure things between the consumers of the service and the actual service running in Azure. When someone loads the home page, Cloudflare normally doesn't have to go to the app service and pull it back. Cloudflare returns it from cache rather than having to go to the origin. The users then go down and they say, I would now like to do a search for my email address. It's going to go through to Cloudflare. It's going to go down into functions, and functions is going to pull a combination of data from table storage, which is where the email address exists, and it's also probably going to pull it from Redis in order to get a list of which breaches the individual has appeared in, and all the metadata around it as well. So it's amazing to look at how much open source has changed, and particularly Microsoft's attitude towards open source as well. Open source almost seems to be this very empowering movement that's given everyone the ability to participate in software, either as consumers or contributors. All of the work I do with Have I Been Pwned is in Visual Studio. It's in there as ASP.NET projects and Azure Function projects. There are a whole bunch of supporting projects. There are console apps and things like that for discrete little tasks that I run. And I do all of that in Visual Studio. But I've also been using Visual Studio Code for things like managing the template for my blog. That's also what I'm using to teach my son to learn how to build web pages, because it's a great way for kids to learn as well. So one of the things that had always driven me since the mid-90s when I started building software for the web is it's almost this dream of I can go and build something myself, just on my spare time, and it can be something massive. It can reach millions of people. It can be out there on the web and fundamentally change the way people work or the way they check their exposure and data breaches or whatever it may be, but you can do it with just about nothing. And that still to this day just totally amazes me.